Good morning. This is Binyam on the Checkin In podcast. Thanks for joining today's episode. This is episode 29. We are just about at 30. Episode 29. Today is the 11th of August, 2021. I'm glad to have all of you joining in for this episode where we're answering today's question. If you could turn back time, what would you do differently and why? If you could turn back time, what would you do differently and why? I do this podcast very intentionally for three specific reasons that are more self-serving than I'd like to admit. Number one, I do this because I want to grow in self-awareness of myself. What does Binyam look like when he is in action in various scenarios in life? I want to understand how I'm able to make the decisions and why I make those decisions, the boundaries that I have in life, the things that matter to me. What is it that goes behind operating the way I do? So self-awareness is a really key aspect. Number two, it's to grow, learn to be kind to ourselves. Learning to be kind to ourselves is one of those challenging things I've observed in this cultural context that we don't do so well, but it's a really necessary component of what it's like for us to set a trajectory and to do so while also remembering that we are human at the very heart. Thank you, Mustafa, just joining on Instagram because TikTok hasn't been featuring me. I know. The new order is going really well, Justin. Thanks for asking. So, secondly, to learn to be kind to ourselves, and then thirdly, to maximize our happiness. These are the three things that I'm aiming for to experience in my own personal life, and I share my experiences with you so that you too can consider what that looks like in your own context as I invite you into this process with me. Again, this is the Checkin In podcast, episode number 29. Today on August the 11th, 2021. Thanks for joining in. We are answering the question, if you could turn back time, what would you do differently and why? Thanks for those for dropping in and saying hello and sharing good love. I see you guys. I'm going to keep on waving whenever I see you guys come into the live stream there as a way of acknowledging your presence. I do appreciate you checking in. I do appreciate the kind words as well. Thank you so much, guys, because that does mean a lot to me. Thank you for being part of this episode on the Checkin In podcast, episode 28. If you could turn back time, what would you do differently and why? I appreciate this question for a variety of reasons. Number one, this is one of those questions that helps us reflect on our past. It gets us thinking about what's gone on in the past. And when I often think about the past, gratitude is not far away because there is so much I've experienced in the past that continues to inform where I'm presently going. Because of the things that have happened in my past, I'm able to have a clearer sight for what's coming in the future. And a huge part of that is because of the element of experience that plays in. Experience for me is a huge teacher. The things I've experienced in the past continue to determine things I want to see happening again. And also, on top of that, it gives me that kind of insight that builds my wisdom to say, I've been in this context before. I've seen what's happened in this scenario before. And based on that experience, I have a better forecast of what's going to happen by way of consistency as I think of the future. This is one of those questions. If I could turn back time, what would I do differently? And why? So there's a few things again that I love about this question. It helps me to look back. And when I look back, there's gratitude there, gratitude for the lessons I've learned. And that's what I see in this question here. It says, what would you do differently if you could turn back time? If I can go back and do that again, based on what I learned back then, that is now informed where I'm presently at, what would I re-implement from my present back there? If I could have learned the lessons somehow in a different way, what kind of scenario would it look like for me to go back there and relearn that again? Hello to everyone who's joining in. Glad to see you, especially those who haven't been here for a while. I see you guys. Thanks for coming in and dropping in. So I love that opportunity to look back reflectively because it gives me a chance also to understand what have I learned along the way. And this is a cool thing. Sometimes we come to an experience and we say, that was interesting, but I'm not sure how it helps me going forward. And we forget to appropriate saying, hey, this is why this is meaningful going forward. For me, when I learn a lesson, I hold on to that lesson. I hold on to it because I don't want to repeat that lesson, especially if it is a painful lesson. There are some very painful experiences I've had in my past that I say, I've learned the lessons. I have the postcard, I have the t shirt. I don't want to go back there again and see what that looks like for me. So I want to learn that lesson and then I want to move on and continue to grow in my ability to make determinative calls that are helpful and beneficial for me in my own personal life. So, along those lines, when I look back, I'm saying, thankful for those lessons, those experiences, but how do they inform where I'm at today? And if I could take what I've learned back there today and what I'm presently implementing by way of my boundaries, by way of my commitments, and if I were to take that back again to where I was before, um, then what would I do then knowing what I know now? And this is one of those questions that some people don't appreciate because they say, "Hey, I'm really happy for where I'm at right now. Everything's good and I value everything I've that's happened to me before because it's made me who I am today, and so I don't need to go back to where I was before." And I say, for me, I find it beneficial to still go back and say, what would I say to my younger version if I had a chance to meet them today? What would I say to that individual based on what I've learned about the experiences that I've gone through that could potentially help them? And that's what I see this question doing. If I could turn back time, what would I do differently? When are you coming back to Clubhouse? I'm being asked here. I've actually been on Clubhouse quite a bit, listening more so. I have yet to consider how to implement that into my life right now. I would love to, because there's so much I would love to share on there too. I just don't know how to do that quite yet. So I am right now in a couple of chats on a regular basis, just kind of benefiting from the kind of content that they are presenting there. But I haven't actually participated in a significant way yet. So stay tuned because I'd definitely love to uh, incorporate this opportunity. I would make more friends, says Trucks, because I feel like the older you get, the harder it's gets finding new people you like to interact with. Really good. I like that. Thanks for sharing that, Trucks. That's a really good point there. Sometimes we make changes as we go along that are different from what our younger experience was. And so we say, how can I prepare for the future by preparing in the past? What can I do in the past to help set me up for the future? And for you, Trex, I hear you saying that you would invest more in those friendships so that it wasn't necessary to have to do that again in the future. Thanks for sharing that. I really appreciate hearing that. One of the other things I love about this question is the why part. Why would I do differently what I'm proposing I would do differently? And this comes full circle for me in saying, here is why this lesson is really important. Here's why this is meaningful for me. And here's how I feel it's going to help me back then if I were to able to have the power to take my lessons today and apply them back then. So, if I could turn back time, what would I do differently? That's a really this question. It's one of those things that, for me, as I reflect on it, gives me a radar on how far I've come and how meaningful those lessons have been in my own current context. When I go back and say, "Yep, this is why this is meaningful and helpful," I almost use my imagination to say, "What would have been different if I had been able to take a lump sum of the courage I'm experiencing now and show it and reveal it to my past self? How would I make decisions differently? What kind of advantages and opportunities would I seize? If I could take what I've learned now about this element here, how could I re implement that back then in a way that's favorable for me so I didn't have to go through all those painful learning, growing pains that I went through? Because those are uncomfortable, those are difficult. And there's a reason why I remember them in the past saying, glad I went through them. I'm not interested in going through them again. But I do understand people who do push back saying, I don't have any desire to go back and do anything differently because I value the person I am today, especially through those experiences. So I do honor that answer. I do acknowledge the place that it has, I just choose not to stay there. I choose to go a little further and say, but I do the, for instance, what could have been. And I find that beneficial for me. So, those are some of the reflections I have going into this question. And there's a few things I would love to share by way of my answers in response to this question. If I could turn back time, what would I do differently and why? So, there's a few things I'm thinking of that I would do differently. And for me, they are definitely locked into those painful experiences that I had along the way. One of the things I would do differently is hmm, I would learn to speak honestly. And this is one of the big themes in my life going forward that you guys are hearing coming up over and over again by way of consistency. I would learn to speak honestly because in speaking honestly, I would be able to grow in courage. I would be able to speak my truth. I would be able to not give a reference to anyone else when I'm giving my perspectives, my ideas, my feelings, my appropriations. I would learn how to be able to give myself in a more genuine way to those I'm in community with. And that would be huge for me because that didn't really happen along the way. My experience was I was very fearful of other people's perceptions of me, their expectations of me. And so I molded myself to try and fit into the ideal that they had set for me. And in doing so, I lost myself. I lost myself in the way that said, this is what who Binyam is, and here's how Binyam reflects when he sees the world he navigates, and why it's important for him to engage this way. These things, I would say, these fumbles, these missed opportunities to be honest and truthful when I had the opportunity, really gave me that sense of not really being honest and present with people. I was always sort of watching and seeing what is it that they expect from me and how can I give that to them, even if it doesn't reflect where I truthfully am. How can I express myself so that I'm always in the acceptance category on their end? That was really important for me. And in so doing, I was giving them a version of me that really wasn't honest. So if I could do something differently, if I could change the time and dial it back to back then, what would it look like for me to have the courage to speak my truth in my faith community when I can say, I'm struggling in this way, I'm not seeing how this really lines up over here, or in response to my family and saying, this isn't what I'm convinced about, and I want you to know that. Although even then, having the courage to do so. I use the word courage to be able to go back and tell the truth because that is a scary thing, isn't it? To speak one's truth. It's a scary thing to be able to say, I'm not on the same page with this. I disagree with this premise. I'm not rowing in the same direction as all the rest of you. That's a courageous thing to be able to step up and say that, right? Especially if it's those who are closest to you. And especially if it's in a context where you may not feel safe speaking your truth. What does that look like for me to dial back in those scenarios where I did not feel safe to speak my truth? That's why I use the word courage. What does courageousness look like for me to go back then and be able to say to the powers that were over my life, I'm not on the same page with this? And to be able to communicate that's still reflected my honor and esteem for these entities in my life, but still from a firm perspective that said, this is not where I'm on the same page with. I wonder what that would look like for me. That's a tough reflection for me. A tough one because as I reflect on it, yeah, it's a scary thing. It's a scary thing to say. Do I have what it takes to go back there and do that? Because that's gutsy. I'm hearing on the Instagram live stream, you're not hearing me as well. Is that right? I'm going to see if I can speak a little bit louder, if that's helpful. And TikTokers, let me know if I'm coming through loud and clear. Thanks for the heads up there. But yes, as I reflect on what I would do differently, it's the courage to speak truthfully. And that for me would have changed so much. It would have it would have meant that I would have to be forthright in the way that I saw the people in my life. I'd have to communicate out of love and saying, I'd rather you have the real Biniam instead of the one that I'm tempted to give you for the sake of acceptance. And what that looks like is for me to be able to say, I'm not on the same page with your ideals here. I'm not on the same page with your convictions on this point here. I don't have a hell yes in response to what you're sharing with me. And here's where I'm coming from. I never felt the safety. I never felt the courage to be able to communicate that way. That's one of the significant things I think I would do if I were able to go back and do things differently. Another thing I would do differently is I wouldn't be as affected by people's expectations of me, especially when it had long term ramifications. And what I mean by this is um, I would, for example, I remember the pressure I felt growing up to be part of a family business. And I had no interest in being part of a family business, no interest at all. It was like, there are things here that I don't think really reflect what I want to experience along the way here. And so, if this is not aligned with what I'm committed to, like if I didn't want to be part of a family business, how could I have said that saying that really doesn't interest me? How could I have said that, especially when I know the response may have been really harsh and kind of damaging, in some ways abrasive, in a way that I wouldn't have reflected what really mattered to me? So, what would it look like for me to tactfully be able to share differences of expectation for myself as I acknowledge me first and foremost, and being able to communicate that? Um, yeah, what would that look like? I would want to think about how to implement those expectations that were set on me by others. Another one of those was, hey, when you grow up, you're going to be this expression in your professional career. You're going to be a doctor, you're going to be a lawyer, you're going to be something successful. And those things brought fear into my life. They instilled fear in me, where I was like, this is not what I want. That they provided plenty of stress. Where internally I was saying, no, that's a hell no to me, but I felt I had to do so. And how much time I invested in going down this pathway where I was fulfilling someone else's expectations of what could be. And as I did that, it was just like, oh, this is not life giving for me. This is not really the place that I want to be resonating with. And so I feel like I have to go on someone else's agenda instead of my own. And I didn't learn how to be able to say, no, this is not what I'm interested in. I'm actually going to explore here. I'm going to take a break here. So the courage again to be able to do it, to push back against those voices, that would have been really critical. So I'm seeing even again here the theme of courage that I would want to express. And courage, especially because I would not know the end outcome. I would not know the end outcome of how to hmm, respond to the pushback. It's a courageous thing to disagree with someone else because, as in the process of disagreeing, it seems that you're preparing for the inevitable unknown. They could say, okay, we're going to respect your boundaries, or they could really rip a chunk out of you. And what would that look like experientially when you're trying to speak your truth? For some people like myself, I think I would have been just shut down into like submission again. So, what would it look like for me to be courageous in keeping very clear? Here's what the main point is. I'm not going to play this game over here where you're going to rip me down because of what I'm choosing to communicate about the real Biniam. And I'm not going to be as prescriptive. And therein is another significant hint that I think I'd want to do differently, is not to be prescriptive in the way that I was supposed to be. Saying, here's the expectation that everyone else has of me, so I'm going to have to fulfill this. Instead of saying, actually, here's where I want to try things out. Here's where I want to ask questions. Where I want to explore. So, what would that look like for me if I could change back time to go back and say, no, I don't want to be in the medical field. I don't want to practice law. I don't want to do these other things that don't resonate with me. Another one of those things for me was the expectation to be in track and field because I was gifted physically to be able to engage and compete in that arena. I didn't have any interest to do that. I hated those races, and yet I felt compelled to be part of them. What would the courage to have been able to speak my truth and saying, I'm not interested, have looked like? In a certain way, this question is causing me to get emotional because when I think about the cost to invest this way, to invest in what I would do differently and the courage that it would have taken for me to express who the real Biniam was, hmm, I'm wondering how I would have been able to be more decisive in my growing up, what kind of lessons I would have learned along the way, what kind of breaks in relationship that I would have experienced that really meant a lot to me. That would be really, really challenging. And so when I think of me going back and trying it all over again, that's a scary thing. It's a scary thing when I think of could I actually implement these things that I would do differently? And for me, that's this huge consistent theme of speaking my truth, having the courage to speak my truth, being able to do it tactfully and courageously speaking my truth so that I could inform my world that I was interacting with where I truly where was. And so that was that was that was, I think, a dream that I wanted to experience back then, but I dared not experience. I dared not experience because I did not have the courage. I did not have the guts to follow through with it. And I'm not speaking in a judgmental tone. It's just I didn't have the courage. There's a reason I didn't ask any girls on any dates when I was growing up until I was 20 in my like late 20s because I didn't have the courage. What would that courage look like for me to be able to express my truth to a girl and saying, I find you fascinating, interesting, and I want to be in a relationship with you. If you're game, let's proceed. If not, then that's okay. What would it have looked like for me to, in the process of speaking my truth courageously and tactfully, being able to grow, not dependent on people's expectations for me? How would I have been different this way? This is one of those things I love to be able to reflect on because this now forms a substance of what I'm able to share with those in my life that I get to interact with, who are asking for my input, my perspectives. I'm sharing from what would I tell myself back then. That's what I'm reflecting on, saying, here's what I've learned now from my experiences back then. And if you don't want to have my experiences, consider these lessons that I've learned. And I'm able to offer those in a meaningful way to others and saying, this is what I didn't do, but this is what I would do if I could now do it all over again. So for me, oh my goodness, it's this whole theme of speaking tactfully and courageously the truth that I really had internally to my world around me. I would not have gone to university right away. I would have taken some time off to get to know me. So I could be self aware, which is one of the big themes of this podcast being self aware, learning to be kind to ourselves. How could I have learned to be kind to myself even then? As I spoke my truth, saying, hey, you know what? People are not really reflecting well on you, but that's okay because that's their own stuff. I can learn to be kind to myself. What would that have looked like for me to be able to go back then and say, what does self care for me look like? How do I tend to me? And how could this be meaningful? And I wonder if I couldn't have experienced more happiness by going through the hard stuff of these uncertainties, these fears, these worries that I harbored, these things that really kept me locked down. I was muted for the longest time. I chose to be muted because I was playing on other people's expectations. I'm in a season now where I'm like, hell no, I'm not doing that. That's not reflective of me or what I want to invest in or put out in this world. And so today I'm a lot more intentional about what I'm saying hell yes to and hell no to. And that is very definitively a hell no. I don't want to go there. What an exercise this has been in reflecting on what would I do differently and why. I would do all this because I'd want to get to be a better version of myself. I would want to get to be a better version of the Biniam that wants to share himself with the world and say, here's why I find value in this. Here's why I'm presenting myself this way. Here's why I am valuing the things I presently value and why my non negotiables are very, very well guarded. I find that when I'm able to have more access to reflections of the past and what I would do differently in the past, it continues to affirm where I'm presently at in the future and in the way I'm going forward. I'm continuing to learn, but it's that context in which, as I'm learning, I'm locking in these things that says, non-negotiables, and this is so important for me. And then I'm able to reflect on them and then give them as a gift to others and saying, here's what I would do differently back then if I could, but here's what I'm presently doing now because those experiences back then that I missed the opportunity to do inform where I am presently at. Dear listener, what would you say if you could turn back time? What would you do differently? And why? I would love to hear some of your reflections. I know I've seen some of them already in the chat. And thank you for sharing those. Um, yeah, what would you do differently? And why would you do that differently? What about your past experience did you were you reflecting on when you said, this is why I'd rather do it differently here? Here's why this is a big deal for me. Let me know in the comments as I bring today's show to a close. There are three key reasons why I love spending time doing this every weekday morning. Number one, I want to grow so aware of Biniam because in doing so, I feel like I'm able to engage my world from a really helpful place. I'm able to engage it from an intuitive place, from a zone where I am reflecting on why this is really important for me. The more I get to know me, the more I get to be able to say, this is the way uh, I work really well. Here's the blueprint to me. And the more I'm able to have access to it, the more I'm able to ask these questions, the better I get to know myself and being able to insist on things that are really important and helpful to me. Number two, I do this because I want to learn to be kind to myself. I want to learn to be kind to myself because this is one of those things that we don't do very well today. We aren't kind to ourselves. Predominantly, most of us rip ourselves apart mercilessly. It's really painful to watch. We do this to ourselves, and it's the worst expression of care for ourselves when we rip ourselves apart. What does that look like for me to say, how can I learn to be kind to me? And then thirdly, I do this so that I can maximize my happiness. Maximize my happiness, especially because it's fun to be in that happy zone. But to get to that happy zone, we have to do some homework on all the other emotions that are impeding the happiness. What does that look like for us to do a deep dive into those uncomfortable emotions like worry, fear, jealousy, anger, all those things we're like, these are uncomfortable. Process them so that we can get to the happy part. These are the three things I'm committed to doing in my personal life. I'm inviting you to join me in this adventure, especially through this podcast as I answer these questions. I'd love for your participation that way. I have a website where I'm also intentionally building a community that is growing in these elements on an ongoing basis. I would love for you to be a part of that. BiniamAstros.com is a website for membership tiers where I'm inviting you to be a part of. I would love to engage with you there, connect with you even, and grow closer in our camaraderie as we aim for this end. This is worthwhile for me, and I want to invite you to join me there. This has been episode 28 on the Checkin In podcast. Thank you so much for joining today. I will see you tomorrow. Bye for now.